Perfect, excellent. So thank you to Peter and to Scott for setting the stage. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, but I think it'll all tie into these bigger questions about the food system. Before I delve into what I mean by community ownership and talking about alternative food systems, I'll just ask you to indulge me in a very short independent activity. Just think of what you had for breakfast this morning. And if you're not a breakfast eater, you can think about your lunch. Consider not just the ingredients, but how the food was processed, how it was transported, how it got to you. Now consider a disruption to that food supply. Consider a natural disaster. Consider a social, political scenario that unfolds that means that the food is not making it to your city and to your home. What do you do now? Who do you reach out to? What are your next steps? Of course, we know that these are not merely thought experiments. We live in a region with a high potential for natural disasters, but I'm actually first going to share with you a case study from the other end of the country that dealt with not a natural disaster, but a social political uprising. And I think that what it'll help us do is highlight some of these real-world food system vulnerabilities and insecurities, and also help us to think through how we might plan for and how we might frame the responses that we can work on now. So picture it. It's the spring of 2015, and Baltimore is uprising, or rioting, depending on who's describing it. But people are in the streets to protest the death of Freddie Gray, a young man who died in police custody. But this was also a broader call for civil rights and a life with dignity. Because at the best of times, some of the people who live in Baltimore City, in the inner city of Baltimore City, were getting most of their groceries from corner stores that looked like this on the left. Some of the corner stores, in fact, a third of them, actually keep their foodstuffs behind glass, so that at no time during your interaction, during your time in the store, do you interact with the food at all. And there's little to no fresh produce, and what's available is overpriced, oversalted, oversugared, full of the pathway to diet-related diseases. When the protests broke out after the death of Freddie Gray and continued for 2 weeks, the reality of the food deserts became even more pressing. Some corner stores went right out of commission, so even these most basic and poor quality foods were no longer available to people. Delivery trucks were not getting into the city. Some of them perhaps would not get into the city. Schools were open irregularly, and this is important because this is in a district where actually every student gets their breakfast and lunch for free through the school system, and where 90 to 95% of students are eligible based on their family's income. So that's a very important food source that's disrupted. Buses weren't running, and in general, people don't have cars to leave the city and go to other neighborhoods. Families and communities were going hungry as the most basic and industrialized of our food supply chain was totally cut off. And so, of course, we need an alternative. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Reverend Heber Brown III. He's a pastor at Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore. Prior to the Baltimore Uprising, he was already known as the Food Reverend because he planted a garden at his church in order to help his congregants, most of whom were elderly, start to interact again with some fresh foods. Most of his congregants were suffering from a host of diet-related diseases in the form of overweight and obesity, hypertension, the potential for stroke. The list goes on and on. But now, with the Baltimore Uprising, people were coming to Dr. Brown with a different problem. They actually couldn't access food to feed their children. What were they going to do? So Dr. Brown called his friend, Aaliyah Fraser, his friend and colleague. She's a farmer of Black Dirt Farm in Maryland. And together they started calling their friends, their colleagues, their farmers, their Black farmers primarily, and distributors that they knew in Maryland, DC, Virginia. And food started coming in immediately into Baltimore City. Good, fresh, high-quality food. The food was processed in the church basement, and then it was driven around in the church van and distributed in neighborhoods where people needed it the most. So they were essentially setting up pop-up food stands after they had pop-up food hubs to collect and distribute the food. What's important here is that it was who they knew. It was their networks and their community that allowed them to develop and to grow this alternative food system. After the action and upon reflection, the Black Church Food Security Network was born. It was a coalition of Baltimore faith leaders, activists, farmers, and it now includes the Baltimore Food and Farming Project out of Johns Hopkins University. The network is not just a way to address food insecurity, but also to grow more partnerships, more stable distribution routes, more access across the African American Northeast communities, as well as lay the groundwork and literally dig the ground for better health. They were transforming church land into measurable public health for self-determination. So the Black Church Food Security Network started to develop as an alternative food system because our global food system stopped delivering. The Black Church Food Security Network is scaling. It's growing up and down the Mid-Atlantic and the East Coast. It's connecting Black farmers, activists, health workers, and faith leaders up and down that region. This is a working map of the people and groups that are involved, that are taking a community-centered and community-owned approach to the food system, highlighting the voices of the people who are most affected by inequality. So we see from this case that food systems happens at various scales. And Peter talked about scales, and we often think about food at this point at the global scale. But of course, we also so often hear about it at the local food system scale, at our farmers markets and eating local. What we're starting to see is that the regional scale has a lot of potential. The regional scale is one that's worth exploring and that's starting to grow throughout the United States. It's a scale that supports the potential for a lot of productivity and a lot of efficiencies built into a more resilient and adaptive situation. Our region, up here on the left coast of the world, it has a wealth of opportunity, but we also have a wealth of uncertainty here. So my question to you is, how can we, with the wealth of the University of Washington, the UW Farm, the faculty, the Keene students, the new food systems, nutrition and health major, and how can we, as members of the community within this room, help to advance the resilience, equity, and community ownership of our regional food system to be better prepared for the uncertainties that we know are going to come to our region? I look forward to discussing that with you following this. Thank you so much.